Welcome everybody to today's AITC webinar that will be a slightly different format than webinars that we have seen before because together with my colleague who will introduce herself in just 1 second, we have decided that we should be hosting a slightly different version of this webinar where we're going to take on a form of Ask a Clinician, Ask an Engineer to discuss AI and technology for healthy aging. So I am Mathias. I'm an assistant professor of computer science with secondary appointments in the School of Medicine. And I'm here today with Alicia. Alicia, you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Alicia Arbaje. I'm an internal medicine and geriatric medicine physician, as well as a researcher on how to improve care for older adults. I'm an associate professor of medicine here at Johns Hopkins, and I also have a joint appointment in our Bloomberg School of Public Health in Health Policy and Management. Great to be here with you all.
Wonderful, thank you, Alicia. So together we essentially are both the co-directors of the TITC, the Technology Identification and Teaching Core of the Johns Hopkins AITC. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about, the different perspectives that people in this space might have on AI and technology for healthy aging. So as I'm sure you are aware, there really are a whole lot of emerging technologies that currently are flooding the space, the healthy aging space. And one of the technologies that we're particularly excited about is of course artificial intelligence, because really what we're seeing is that this technology is transitioning from the sandbox to real-world use simply because of the increased abilities of solving very hard problems. In fact, just to convince you that indeed AI is now at a point where we can solve very complicated problems, all the images that you will see as part of today's presentation are in fact completely AI generated. And I spent my last days using some of the most recent generative models to create some artwork for today's presentation. So if you enjoy it, I will be happy to share with you how to do that yourself in the future. But just emphasizing my point that AI is really at a position now where it starts impacting everyday life and allows us to solve problems that previously were quite difficult to solve. And especially in this healthy aging space, as we will discuss in the remainder of this webinar, there are lots of opportunities on how artificial intelligence in particular, but technology in general, can help us solve complicated problems. But of course, this is a very complicated space. And so we really need to think hard about, well, how should we position ourselves? How should we think about solving problems in this space so that we best capitalize on the benefits of AI and technology to solve the hard problems that exist at the bedside or in people's homes? What are the major opportunities that we as researchers, as providers, but also, of course, companies should tackle now in order to drive the best possible transformation and really benefit the life of the caregivers as well as the aging adults? And of course, whenever there's opportunity, there also is challenge. So what are the major challenges that right now we are facing if we want to think about developing AI and technology to benefit the life of aging adults, ultimately ourselves? So as I mentioned in the beginning, Alicia and I were thinking that we should be trying to provide you with a multidisciplinary take on trying to sketch some answers to these fundamental questions that we're facing when we think about developing AI and technology for healthy aging. So this brings me to the first question that I have for you, Alicia, which is this one. So how do I actually make my project relevant to the needs of older people and their families?
Thanks, Mathias. I think it's just the answer can sound surprisingly simple, which is just to ask. And the reason I'm bringing this up because it's sometimes we think we know what an older person wants, or we think we know what we want when we get older, or maybe we have had experience doing something with our family and understanding what they might want. But people really have, every person is their own world, right? And so it's really important to begin to ask, what are the key issues? And I bring it up because it's important to ask, I think, at 3 different stages. at the beginning, or actually throughout, right? At the beginning of the design of a research project, maybe there's a technology someone's thinking about designing, asking the end user in advance, right? Is this even a reasonable research question for relevance to your life? Does this study design make sense to you? And do these outcomes that we've chosen actually matter to you? And while the end user may or may not be a scientist, they can tell you what their goals and their values are, and that can help the scientists shape the research question. And I think as research is going on, it's important to recheck or have an iterative process in which we're checking with our end users, our stakeholders. And by that, I mean our older adult, the clinicians, maybe it's other scientists who are going to be using this technology. Maybe it's policymakers, right? Maybe it's an insurance company. But to continue to ask, hey, how are we doing? Are we recruiting the right people to be testing this technology? Can they look at data so far that we've collected and tell us what they think about it? So to not like wait till the end. But once we get to the end, I think it's also important to ask older adults and their caregivers, what do you think of the data that we found? Is it, again, relevant to you and your life? Is this going to make your life better? Or can you see how it might in the future? Can you help us think about how to disseminate this information? What are the information sources you use to get information? Is it Google? Is it your doctor? Is it, a trusted friend or family member? So how do we disseminate to the people that you trust? And then finally, what would you recommend we do differently the next time we do this work? So really thinking of the older adult and their care partner or their caregiver as a partner in research, not just as the study subject. And so I think that's one easy or hard maybe way of understanding if the work is relevant. So now, I hope that was helpful. I have a question for you as an engineer. How do engineers, like I'm not an engineer, how do engineers select the best projects to work on?
Well, that is a wonderful question. I think that the way I like, and with my team, we like to think about it, is really this exact pivotal point where possible reward of capitalizing on that solution just meets opportunity. Right? So those are the most important things that we generally think about when we think about selecting the most rewarding projects, because on the one hand, we want to make sure that we're solving the right problem, and that is difficult to identify, but also we need to be able to make a good first step in actually solving it. And so the way that we would be approaching this is because as engineers, oftentimes you find people with a tool in search of a problem. And this is generally not the right approach of trying to really change and transform healthcare. Because the problems are very intricate, and engineers might speak from some experience, their personal ones, but this experience is not necessarily reflective and representative of all the lived experiences that the caregivers and the target patients might actually be facing. So in collaboration with multidisciplinary teams, like yourself or other people who are, nursing providers, care providers, either professional or family, we can work together to identify exactly these high reward issues that people truly have when they care for elderly adults, or when they are performing the job that we want to be impacting and transforming. And that really allows us to just understand, well, is there a need? How big is the need? And what is the possible reward of actually getting the solution right? So this is where a lot of the multidisciplinary collaborations comes from, and that's why I am very happy that my appointment is not just in the School of Engineering, but also in the School of Medicine, because it essentially just speaks to exactly the opportunity to do this multidisciplinary work, identify the most challenging and rewarding problems, and then build solutions that help us go there. Now, what's important also in the way how I like to think about solving problems is that we need to delay identifying solutions. And the need why this is important is because most of the problems are incredibly complex. It's essentially a whole ecosystem where a solution would need to be integrated with. And so the problem that a person comes to you with might not, in fact, be the true problem that you need to be solving, simply because they voice and they experience and express their frustration, but they might not, in fact, reflect objectively on the overall solution space. So being able to take the frustration for what it is, frustration, and a problem in need of a solution, we need to delay exactly believing that we know which problem exactly we need to be solving based on just a few conversations. So rather than doing this, we need to immerse ourselves. We need to understand what truly the whole solution space might be. Based on this type of immersion, we can then go in and we can be very creative. We can brainstorm possible ideas that might attack the initial problem that was brought to us, but it might also attack the problem from slightly different approaches and essentially solve a problem that might come earlier in that whole progress chain that might prevent that problem from becoming a frustration to begin with. The other issue that I see a lot in engineering disciplines, in addition to us, being problem solvers by design, right? We're trained to solve problems. Somebody gives us a problem, we know the solution, right? That's how we run exams. And that's why brainstorming is so important to delay identifying a solution. But another thing that I think we need to adopt a little bit more from practices like human-centered design is to understand that if we're trying to impact workflows, usually people are a part of this. So we're not innovating in a vacuum. We're innovating in a space where people interact with one another, where people interact with the environment, where people just generally perform very complex tasks. And so the solution that we build does not only need to work on the bedside, on the benchtop, in an environment that we have created and set up such that the system can succeed, but it needs to succeed in a very complicated environment where people have expectations, where people create mental models solely based on what they see from the system from the outside. And so building solutions that can succeed in very complicated environments is incredibly complicated. So rather than building the best possible solution directly from the get-go and believing that this is the thing that will work at the end, we should delay building fully fledged prototypes for the benefit of being able to test more. So essentially starting with very, very simple approaches, like for example, when we think about AI algorithms, we don't actually have to build an AI algorithm. We can mock it up using simple tools like PowerPoint, like Figma, like all sorts of other things. And we can present people with mock-up interactions with that AI algorithm, which allows us to understand, well, do these people actually use the algorithm in the way that we intend them to use it? Do they exhibit any cognitive biases when they interpret the recommendations that we provide them with? Right? Is this a solution that truly is fit to perform in the field, or do we exhibit, poor human-machine teaming type of approaches, right? So the whole vignette here is an attempt to fail quickly to succeed fast. Right? So we want to understand whether some ideas are or are not suitable at all. And if they are not suitable, we want to discard them as early as possible because we don't want to run into cost fallacies, right? Sunken cost fallacies. So not thinking a lot of cost, but building easy prototypes, identify the most promising solutions. And then once we have built confidence that these solutions may truly work for the people that we're building for, then we invest time, we invest effort, and we build the solutions that hopefully, when combined, when translated and deployed in the real world, can have the positive impact that we hope to achieve when we initially set out to identify the reward. Now, let me ask you another question, Alicia. When we're thinking about building this technology, it's all about well-being. But for the older adults, what does well-being actually mean?
This is such an important question, and it follows along with what you've been talking about creating a bit of a paradigm shift in the way we think about research, think about design, and think about the linear sort of timeline that we may have been used to. In my mind, I think the first step is to go beyond what I call the biomedical model. The biomedical model is the idea that we have diseases and pathology that leads to those diseases and risk factors for those diseases. And therefore, we should design treatments for a particular disease. And once we've designed a treatment, then we have improved somebody's well-being. And that is sort of the whole paradigm of medicine, or it can be, but it should not be limited to that if we're thinking about health. And even more broad than health is well-being, because well-being may include other aspects of happiness or contentment. And so going beyond the medical model, I have some examples here. of what might start to do that. We have the 5 M's, which is a sort of conceptual way of thinking about care that is designed for older adults. And these are key domains that matter to older people. So the mind, right? So how is somebody's cognitive functioning? That can contribute to their well-being. Mobility, so how is their physical functioning, right? Are they able to get to the grocery store on the weekends? Are they able to pick up their grandchild? Medications. So that is actually one of the biggest problems older people face, is that they're on so many that it's hard to manage. It's hard to literally manage how to get them, how to pay for them, how to administer them, how to store them, how to keep them safe, and how to monitor the side effects, which are really not on the side. They're front and center to older people. Then there's multi-complexity, which is the idea that older people, and people in general, not just older people, may have multiple conditions affecting them: high blood pressure, diabetes, cancer, heart disease. And each one of those has a different way of being treated, some treatments may conflict for the treatments for the other conditions. So they're complex in the different things that are affecting their physiology. And then what matters most is the 5th M, which is what we were talking about a little bit earlier. What matters most to that older person? And so we said mind, mobility, medications, multi-complexity, but maybe what matters most to them is to be able to, build the house they've always been dreaming of, or move, or travel, or go to somebody, one of their children's weddings or something like that. Like, what matters most? Or maybe it's preventing a stroke or preventing a heart attack, or maybe they don't care about those and they really just don't want to be in pain. So these are the kinds of things that begin at getting beyond the biomedical model. So that's sort of one framework, the 5 M's, is to thinking about what contributes to well-being. Another one is social connectedness. And this was blown wide open with the pandemic. Before, we had a challenge with social isolation and loneliness, but then with the pandemic, with the lockdowns and with the sort of paralysis in a way of social interaction, and we even called it social distancing, right? Instead of physical distancing, we called it social distancing. And it really did lead to some people being socially distant from others in a more connectedness sense. And so social connectedness is a key component of well-being. And how can we foster that? And the opposite kind of that might be loneliness. So that might be another way to think about it, though we like to think of using the term connectedness. Then there's this idea of life space mobility that contributes to people's well-being. And so what that means, it's a gerontological term that talks about what is the space in which someone conducts their life. Some people can get on a plane and go travel. Other people maybe stay in their hometown. Some other people maybe just go to the grocery store and back. Other people don't leave their house. And then some people don't leave their room. Right? So these are people with vastly different life space mobilities. And so figuring out what level of life space mobility brings well-being to that person is important. So anything that can increase somebody's life space mobility usually can contribute to well-being if it is within the desire of that older person. Then we know from other studies that having a sense of purpose is very important to somebody's well-being. We know from like the blue zones, for example, if you've heard of those people, where the areas of the world where people live the longest, that one of the things that we think contributes to that longevity is that people have a sense of purpose. Maybe it's a sense of community. Maybe it comes from their faith. Maybe it comes from helping others. But having a sense of purpose is very key to helping people feel well, no matter what diseases, right, they have, no matter what their biomedical state. And then finally, this idea of legacy, especially as people get older and sort of begin to, if they haven't already, confront their mortality, right? It becomes even more and more important to feel like they're giving back or leaving some kind of imprint on the world. And that can be called a sense of legacy. And so part of somebody's well-being is, do they feel like they're doing that? And what is there helping people identify that legacy, if that's important to them, and how to put that into action. So all of these things, and there may be other things that contribute to well-being here, but these are some domains and conceptual frameworks that are important, I think, for people to think about as you're developing a technology, developing something, is which one of these are you helping with? And can you help with multiple of them? And that might help guide what a good research question might be. So hopefully that was helpful. And let's ask you now a question around what you talked earlier in the beginning of the presentation about challenges come with opportunities and opportunities come with challenges. So where do you see now the largest challenges in getting AI and technology to older adults, to families, to patients?
Yeah, that's a very important one, because I think as part of our AITC, and I think together with others, we put out this big paper that essentially is talking about this translation gap, which means that we're all quite savvy researchers, and even if we build multidisciplinary teams and are capable of identifying, the problems that are really rewarding to solve, if we get it right, and then we develop very cutting edge solutions that allow us to get closer, we really don't see the technology, artificial intelligence or other technologies, impact the life of the elderly and the caregivers just yet. And I think the problem is complex. It's always difficult to pinpoint the one culprit that results in this translation gap. But really what we're seeing is a very complicated landscape where, in a way, while there's not enough funding, there is comparably a lot of funding for very basic research. So we start with an idea, we understand that there is an unmet need, we can very clearly outline the significance and how building a solution might impact, betterment of patients or caregivers. And we have an approach on how to solve this. So this is essentially a basic research question, because we have some preliminary work, we have an opportunity, so now we need to build it. And for this, we get a lot of funding from the NIH, from the NSF, from other institutes. And so we really are very good at solving these types of problems. Once we have developed the types of solutions and we have published our peer-reviewed articles and we have demonstrated that it's feasible, we have demonstrated that there is likely to be, that we would expect the benefit if we were to translate this, at that point, we need to really think about, well, okay, how do we move this out of our academic ivory tower environment into the real world? And that requires translational efforts that is very difficult to do just on the side, because academics, right, you have a practice next to your research efforts, then you do your research. Well, I have a teaching mission, I have a research mission. And so standing up a full translational effort in addition to everything else that we're doing, that requires full-time efforts, this is what companies are doing, is incredibly hard. And so while it's possible to get some funding that allows us to translate slowly but surely, like the SBIR grants provided by the NIH or the NSF and other small business and industry partnership awards that are for translational efforts and can help us build out our solutions from a research product closer to a true industry product that can be deployed into the real world, the funding there is much less compared to the funding that we have for basic research. The other thing is really, right, that we need to have people who truly care about the translation, because it is a lot of work, and it really means that they cannot just continue doing whatever else they were doing. They need to take a break from other things they were doing and invest a lot of time in the translational effort. And so what that means is that if this person, the initial inventor of the solution, is not interested in doing this, well, then there needs to be just a very opportune combination of other people who are interested in picking it up, who have an entrepreneurial spirit and can help move this translation closer to patients. Because the issue really is, right, that translational efforts, they don't really fit this conventional academic reward model where we're interested in publishing, potentially getting grants and doing other things. Translation is interesting, and we care about it deeply, because at the end, we want to make sure that the research, the basic research that we're all pursuing, has fundamental impact to patients and impacts the real world at the end of the day. But doing this, in addition to everything else, is incredibly complicated. So I think we need to think hard about how we might be encouraging this very hard work that comes after demonstrating feasibility and demonstrating initial positive benefits of specific solutions, to enable people to take the risk of commercializing some of those translations, so that we can capitalize on the benefits of the basic research that is funded by the NIH and so on at scale. Now, we already talked a little bit about these opportunities and how to need find. Now, my next question for you is this one. So what do you think are the key problems that older adults and their families right now would need fixing?
Yeah, so I'll start that off by saying that really for most people, and I'm generalizing here, we should ask individuals, but in general, in my experience, it's really about how do we improve their quality of life. So what are the things that are impacting an older person's and the family's quality of life? You could have, you could think about it in your own families. And if you've had this experience, what are the things that just really are challenging, right? So here are some ideas around what some of those things could be that we could target for fixing, right? I put in quotes because, it's hard to actually fix, but we should be trying as best we can. So one is, and we skip over this one quite a bit. We oftentimes in the traditional biomedical model, the prevention of disease. We often don't as clinicians jump in until a disease is present. And we do our best for secondary prevention or tertiary prevention to try to prevent worsening of the disease or a complication of a disease. But how about reversing the disease or preventing it in the first place? And so those are pieces I think that are very important, because we know that disease itself leads to healthcare encounters, medications, appointments, and to a chipping away at people's well-being oftentimes. And so to the extent that we can focus on prevention, if it's at all possible, or disease reversal, I think that's key. Secondly, a promotion of independence. If you ask an older person, what is like the most important thing to you? Well, I want to be able to take care of myself and not be a burden to my children. That's like mostly the number one thing people say. And a feeling of independence, especially in our current culture, and especially in Western culture, is very highly valued. Interdependence is valued in other cultures a bit more than it is here. Here, it feels very hard to depend on anyone for anything. And then it's almost a damage to one's self-worth. And so while we can argue the merits or drawbacks of that philosophy, we do know that anything that can help improve someone's independence usually leads to improving people's well-being. And then helping people cope with existing illness. This is something that unfortunately is also often challenging in a traditional biomedical model, where we focus on treating disease, but not on treating the person who is dealing with the disease, and helping them find coping strategies, whether that's emotional support, spiritual support, nutritional support, providing community resources, task support, like teaching people how to take care of themselves. These are things that we need help with in our healthcare system. So how do we help people cope with illness, understand their medications, understand their plan, understand what nutritional approaches they can take or lifestyle approaches to reverse their illness? These are things that we can help with, that we need help with. Another one, and this is, I don't know if it's a product of just our own healthcare system, but it's particularly challenging in the US healthcare system, and that is navigating the healthcare system. I'm sure each of you has a story or more about the challenges of doing this. And what do I mean by that? Getting an appointment, right? Getting a test scheduled, going to get the medications, following up on test results, making a specialist appointment, telling the specialist what the primary care doctor said, going back when you're done with that appointment and telling the primary care doctor what the specialist said, right? You could go on and on, being in a hospital and making sure that the care is, appropriate for your loved one, making sure they get the right medications. And that's just as a family member. The same is true for us as healthcare providers and physicians, trying to make sure that our patients get the right care. We're often serving this role of trying to help people navigate and trying to be the care coordinator. So this is a place where I especially think technology can be helpful, is in helping to create shared information exchange and care coordination supports in which people's voices are heard and incorporated into care plans. The other place that can improve where we need help with improving quality of life is in de-prescribing treatments and medications. I put medications here, but it can be treatments as well. And what do I mean by that? Most of people's healthcare encounters are about receiving more interventions, but there does come a time, and often that time is earlier than one thinks, in which we should begin to remove medications or interventions that may be causing more harm over time. So there is a strong movement in teaching healthcare providers and patients on messaging around undoing medications when the risk-benefit ratio is no longer favorable. And so we could have technology that could support that effort. And then finally, support for healthcare related tasks at home. I mentioned some of this a little bit earlier, which is how do we help people actually execute their care plan? How do we help them take their medications on time? Or how do we help them get the optimal foods from the grocery store, or cook the right meals for their particular condition? Or how do we support the caregiver who's maybe exhausted because they have a full-time job, they have their own families, and they're caring for an aging parent, for example? Like, how do we support those people to make sure they're caring for themselves? Those are examples of health-related tasks that need help. Maybe it's also exercises that they need to do, or maybe it's practicing what they were taught in the hospital to do for their dressing change, for example. So here's where I think simulation can be super helpful in helping people practice what we're hoping they can do to improve their health. So these are just some ideas of things that need help, but the bottom line is things that can improve people's quality of life. So let me ask you now, we've been speaking about well-being. How can we enhance well-being using technology?
So I think the avenues that we might be able to increase well-being along, you already mentioned those, and really with our pilots and just looking at the literature and understanding a little bit on what people are working on, where they see the biggest the biggest opportunities. I think these are the ones that come to mind. And really, there is no unifying theme among them, other than they are all geared towards increasing the well-being, both of the aging and aging adults, as well as their caregivers or providers caring. So there's a lot of opportunities. The ones that I want to be briefly discussing are the ones on the slide, where I will start with smart home technology, where we're now getting to the point where we can integrate in the devices that we have at home in everyday life. We can integrate sensing capabilities that allow us to understand certain activities that are happening within the home. For example, we can understand gait patterns, we can understand activity levels, we might even be able to understand respiratory rates and overall posture, which essentially just allows us to, without invading too much into the home, because these are sensors that are not necessarily cameras, they are based on radar, so they don't really give us a lot of identifying information, but they do provide a lot of information of the activities that people are performing in their homes, and allow us to monitor from remotely, the activity and overall health and well-being of people inhabiting this home. And that can provide additional levels of assurance that allows people to stay in their homes longer, because there is a sense of security that if something catastrophic would happen, people would be alerted and there would be help relatively. In a very similar line of reasoning, there is a lot of emphasis on wearables that can be simple, like the wearables that we are already very accustomed to, like smart watches or other types of devices. But it can go even further with, sensorization of all sorts of devices of everyday life, like sensors sewn into the fabric of T-shirts that allow us to measure sweat output, that allow us to measure electrophysiological signals, and all sorts of other devices and signals that are important to monitor people's health, again, people's activity levels, or other tasks of daily life. One example that I found particularly interesting is a wearable that is capable of listening to people's conversations, to transcribe in real time the conversation, for people to not just hear the conversation, but essentially read it at the same time, which is incredibly valuable for people who have difficulty hearing. Right? It's like real time or real world captions, essentially, if you want. Right? So wearables really open up a new space of building, sensing technology and monitoring technology, but also new interactions that we can use to build new, communication strategies with people. There is a big effort, of course, in autonomous mobility, self-driving and these types of things that are not all of those, right, is generally cast in this level of healthy aging and increasing the well-being of people. But I think the reason why it's important to mention when we're talking about increasing the well-being of aging adults is the fact that loss of mobility, especially when people are no longer able to drive their own cars, is one of the primary reasons that drives people out of their homes, especially in rural communities, because they are no longer able to see the doctors, to get themselves to the appointments, to buy groceries for themselves. And so this is where autonomous mobility might provide solutions in the future and allow people to stay in their homes even when they are living in more rural communities where public transportation and other services are not abundantly available. There is a huge push in the robotics communities these days, where robots are going to emerge soon as parts of everyday life, for example, in the form of service or other types of support robots. So that can be just, you know, a robotic device that inhabits the same home and allows to pick up and fetch specific items so that people don't need to do as much if that is something that causes them problems. Or just robots that are, you know, they can engage, they can converse, and so they are serving more emotional purposes that essentially help prevent desocialization. With You already mentioned, I think, in for a training application, the emergence of simulation, and that really brings us to a whole different set of types of experience where we can simulate all sorts of experiences in immersive virtual reality environments that really allow us to provide people who otherwise are bedbound and they don't have a very large mobility radius, maybe limited to a single room, but we can provide them with experiences that take them into very special places that are important to them and have them revive specific memories or benefit from, you know, enjoying a little bit of outdoors, if even just through the lens of a virtual reality headset. So there are lots of opportunities. You might have seen recently the viral videos of ICU patients being given such an experience with a virtual reality headset. So these experiences are now coming, and they seem to have quite a positive impact on people's well-being. Of course, when we talk about aging, then disease is always one issue. And so what we're really seeing is a lot of algorithms right now that are being put forward that allow us to detect disease earlier, that allow us to more accurately forecast prognosis or diagnose specific conditions, especially in complicated patients that have multiple conditions going on at the same time. And so they are really designed to help us tailor specific decisions and treatment plans to individual patients so that we can get it right. Now, this is really just, you know, the tip of the iceberg of specific applications and application domains that we see artificial intelligence and technology making their first occurrences to impact the life of aging adults. But there's a whole lot of other opportunities and different products that people are impacting. And I'm really curious to see what will come out of the AITC pilots in the next couple of years. Now, moving on to, I think, the last question that I have for you, which is, what do you think, Alicia, what are the key problems that the healthcare systems and providers need to fix to support older adults and their families?
Yeah, and I think hopefully some of what I'll comment here might answer one of the questions that's come up. And if not, Stefano will get to it at the end, which is this idea of digital health literacy. When it comes to what healthcare systems struggle with in helping to improve health and well-being for older adults, it's really been in particular around communication. We know that communication is the number one, poor communication is the number one reason that malpractice lawsuits occur. It's usually around a failure of communication, maybe of a diagnosis, maybe of a treatment plan, et cetera. And that's not the only reason we care about communication. We know that it's critical for team functioning. It's critical for surgeons and anesthesiologists in the OR. It's critical for nurses in the home with the patients and families. It's critical, critical, critical. So any technological innovation that can improve communication is going to be extremely high yield because it's a nut we have not been able to crack. Now let's get into it a little bit more. What do we mean about communication? Well, I like the term shared mental models, which I've borrowed from some of our engineering colleagues. The idea, are we all on the same page? Do we have a shared idea or conceptualization of what the challenge is or what the problem is that we're trying to face? And with older people dealing with healthcare problems, the shared mental model might be, right, whose job is it to care for this older person and what are their tasks? Or the shared mental model might be around, well, what is the treatment plan for this particular condition and how are we helping to shape this treatment plan to be reaching the goals that the person wants? So those are just some examples of if technology could support ways of creating shared mental models and disseminating, making sure they're actually shared, I think is important. Related to this idea is the care coordination and information exchange. So while electronic medical records have begun to assist in this regard, they are by no means solving this problem, and if anything, on some level, making part of this worse. So information exchange is key, especially during transitions in care, which is where I spend a lot of my research time on, my personal research time in this space, which is on how do we help improve coordination and communication when people are experiencing a transition in their health or in their physical location, say going from the hospital to home, or going from the home to the emergency department, or going from the nursing home back to the emergency department, et cetera. So that piece of an older person's journey through our healthcare system is a highly dangerous point in time where many errors can occur. And supporting that coordination and information exchange is a key problem that needs fixing in our healthcare system, getting people to be able to relay the information across settings. I think we talked a little bit about this earlier, but this idea of the risks and benefits of interventions for people with multi-complexity. So I mentioned this movement towards deprescribing or undoing interventions and removing them as people get older, or when the risk-benefit ratio doesn't seem favorable. And so I do think we need technological support to help people make this decision. Clinicians making this decision. There's an art to it, but there should also be a science to it. And I think we need more data to help us in the healthcare system make those decisions. And then the final 2 points here, it seems so obvious, but it doesn't happen so much these days, right? Getting to know our patients as people. How can technology help us get to know our patients better? What if when a patient came to the hospital, I had a whole simulation of their home environment that I could look at to help make the treatment plan? What if I had videos of what they used to be like before they became confused and are now in the ICU? So could we create with technology representations of reality, past realities that we want to reconfigure or get to, or a future reality that we want to create for this person in their home environment? So, and also getting to know them as people through their likes, their interests, that kind of thing. Those are the kinds of things that can help us treat people better, is if there's ways of gathering that information that's not labor intensive. As labor intensive, I should say. And then finally, this is sort of an older use of technology to help the well-being of older people, but I don't want to forget about it, which is how do we create an actual healing environment through design? So, our colleagues in architecture have really spent a lot of time in this particular space, but are there ways that this could be even bolstered further? How do we actually create a healing hospital space? How do we create a hospital that's easy to navigate? How do we create a home that has structural healing environments, open spaces, access to fresh air, those kinds of things? Like, technology can also be helpful in this particular space. So I think these are just there's many other things that need fixing in our healthcare system, especially around access, which I didn't mention here. But I think those are some of the ideas that I think can be useful as we think through how can technology support this effort. So with that, now I'll turn it back to you. What are some dangers, or maybe I should say, are there any dangers associated with AI and technology? And I'm sure you'll help us think through some of that.
Yeah, of course, in a way it's sad that we're closing with this, but I think it's important to briefly mention the issues that we're currently facing with this type of technology also, because as we are releasing artificial intelligence into the wild, we also need to think a little bit about what detrimental effects these types of algorithms might have for us, in addition to the benefit. So I will say that before getting people too concerned, is that there certainly are some issues, but the good news is that research is definitely on it, and people are aware of these issues and trying to combat them from multiple different perspectives. The one issue that we have been finding is that while we're very excited about the overall prospect of having artificial intelligence around us because of all these complex problems that it can help us solve, it turns out that these algorithms are surprisingly brittle when deployed in unconstrained environments. Like, for example, we might be developing these algorithms based on lots and lots of examples that characterize, an idealistic world, but the real world is not idealistic. And so immediately when we expose these algorithms to the new settings, they end up failing because it's not something that they know how to deal with, given how we have developed them. So this is something where we need to be very careful, because the algorithms, they will not tell us that this is a new scenario and their expected performance is low. They will essentially just make recommendations with a similarly high confidence as they did it before in the charted territories. And if we're not aware that this might be ongoing, then we might be trusting incorrect predictions at times where we really shouldn't. So understanding how we might be able to empower people to better interpret the results and the reliability of the recommendations is going to be something that we really need to care about. Another thing that we need to target is biases. So that's because the algorithms, especially machine learning based models, are most of the time developed based on historically collected data. And so this means that if we're training algorithms to mimic historic processes, then if the historic processes somehow suffered from specific biases that affect decision-making processes, then our algorithms will essentially reverberate exactly those biases and potentially are then discriminatory or exhibit all sorts of other undesired behavior. So understanding whether the data that we're using to develop our algorithms is unbiased and properly reflects the values that we want our new solutions to reflect is incredibly important. And tools are on the horizon that allow us to better do this so that we're not causing harm by, being discriminatory with respect to protected characteristics or otherwise. There, of course, are other opportunities that really just emerge from maliciousness, not as much the technology itself, but it's something to really be concerned about, because when we're looking at some of this recent generative AI, one that we're using here to generate all of these images, you can see the quality of generation that currently is possible. And this is not just the case for creating images based on text prompts. It also exists with recreating voices based on videos or animating the videos of people to say things that in reality they didn't say. These were all issues before, so it's not something that is particularly new. It's just that we're injecting into such an environment and landscape tools that really allow us to do this at scale and to do it fast. And so as a consequence, if we have people with malicious intent, they now have a different set of tools that allow them to engage in different type of criminal activity. And empowering people, especially older adults who might be at risk of falling victim to something like those malicious intents, is incredibly important to teach them so that they have ways of telling that this is something that is not trustworthy and they can protect themselves. They have the tools, they have the awareness, they have the knowledge to prevent to take themselves out of harm's way and prevent harm. And this is really where some of the efforts that we are very passionate about in teaching and raising awareness comes from, so that more people know what the current capabilities are, so that they can prevent these things from happening, hopefully. Now, this brings us to the end of what we had for you in today's webinars, where really as just a few concluding thoughts, we hope that we've been able to convince you that AI and technology is still igniting a revolution in healthy aging and providing many new perspectives on how we might accomplish this. And really, there's a lot of progress along many dimensions, where we see innovations in diagnosis, we see innovation in prevention, in increasing the well-being and enhancing mobility, among other things. But there also are a few challenges that I think researchers and companies are really after together to try and solve those solutions for the better in the future. I would like to conclude by saying that really the AITCs that we have here at Hopkins and beyond are really a tremendous resource for us to advance this field of healthy aging, and are uniquely positioned to accelerate the progress in technology-enabled healthy aging, simply because we address the problem from multiple perspectives, such as stakeholder engagement, teaching and technology identification and teaching, as well as commercialization efforts. So with this, I would like to close today's session. I would like to thank you in the name of Alicia, of course, for your attention, for joining us today. And if you have any questions, we will be available for answers right now, or you can reach us over email at the email addresses that you see on the slide. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mathias, and I'll add my thanks to the group, and appreciate the that there are already a few questions. I can start with the first one if that sounds good, because it looks like it was addressed to me, and then it looks like, Mathias, there's one for you, and then maybe a general question. So the first question about how difficult, from Stefano, how difficult, it's difficult for older adults to manage their healthcare. So what are the thoughts on digital health literacy and how can it support older adults in their independence? 100% important, right? Like with a caveat, and I'll share that in a minute. So of course, people, older adults need to be not only health literate, but digitally literate, and then together digitally health literate to be able to manage. What I might say. And so I think it's important to have efforts in those spaces. What I might say are two things. There's two pieces here that I'll add. One is and this gets a little bit at your second question towards Mathias, who is the end user here? Sometimes with a technology, it's the caregiver. It can be the older person, and we shouldn't design around or not including them, right? Only to the caregiver, but we should think about that older adults are heterogeneous, right? Some people are going to be 80 years old and texting, and some people are going to be 60-year-olds and no phone at all, right? So it's not about the age. It's not even about their disease. It's not even about fully their cognitive status or their cognitive diagnosis. It's a conglomerate of things. What am I trying to say? Like a bunch of different things interfacing together. And so I think that's a challenge for an engineer trying to make it a technology, because then who do you target, right? Do you target the whole heterogeneous bunch, or do you focus on a certain skill level? And so I think that's one thing to keep in mind. Second is that I think it's important to, one perspective is to teach the older person or caregiver to use your technology. The other perspective is to design it such that it doesn't need that much teaching. Now, I'm not an engineer, and that may be asking for way too much, but if we could have the perspective that we design something that actually maybe doesn't require a lot from that person, because part of the teaching we're doing is teaching around bad design, right? If the font was bigger, if the thing was louder, if it, then we wouldn't need to have all this education to get someone to learn how to use their technology. So how can we design technology for an aging population as opposed to for the younger population, which we're all sort of thinking about, and then try to retrofit it for an older person? And so having that sort of paradigm shift. And then the final thing I'll say is to keep in mind, a key principle is that older adults may be in non-traditional environments. So they may have no caregiver, they may have one, they may have five, it may be their spouse, it could be their next door neighbor, it could be a long distance caregiver overseas. So keeping in mind that there are many different caregiving arrangements, and that you have to kind of think about how that technology can adapt to those many different kinds of arrangements, which is only all to make your job harder. But I hope that got a little bit at your question, Stefano. And then Mathias, it looks like there is a follow-up for you there. And I don't know if you can see it or I can read it for you.
If you want to read, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I'll read it. It says, Mathias, based on the different dimensions you mentioned, what are your thoughts on a person's digital literacy level in affecting the development of the product? Should we build around that, or on the idea that there will always be a caregiver to assist them with their technology?
Yeah, this is a great point. I think you have already touched on many aspects of this question also, which I think that we need to understand who we are developing for. I think it is not a safe assumption to say that if we're developing for older adults, there will always be somebody with a higher level of technical literacy around them. And that really puts, I think, puts an emphasis on one of the points that I made earlier, which is trying to engage a bit more in human-centered design practices so that we have a way of understanding early whether the design dimensions or design aspects that we think might be a solution for, elderly adults who have a low technical literacy level, whether they actually get along with the technology that we think about building, or whether they essentially are lost without additional help. So this is, I think, really just emphasizing the point that I tried to make there, to understand who are we targeting, what is the scenario that we think the technology will be deployed in, and then making sure that this can actually work by involving the stakeholders that we're developing for, and just see, right, whether they actually can succeed in the situation that we put them in.
And then maybe, thank you, Mathias, as a follow-up, this one may be better answered by you, which is Japhus asks, how close are we to deploy fully articulate and autonomous robot systems for assisting aging in place persons with daily tasks in their home environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. These making predictions is hard, especially about the future. But the I would say that this one component there, which is fully articulate, it seems to hint at human-like bipedal type robots. Those are incredibly difficult to develop and put out in the real world. We now see some initial prototypes that are navigating the real world, but they are not really autonomous in their pursuit. There are, however, in fact, in the lab just outside my office door here, there is in fact a commercially available in-home service robot that is capable of navigating the environment and has an arm attached to it so they can fetch things and open doors and do things like this. So I think that the whole spectrum of robotics, the one that we feel looks very futuristic, and that's potentially a little bit farther away, but other solutions that are designed to just navigate the spaces and solve specific subtasks that are not, very high utility and general purpose, but they can do specific things quite well. Those we already see coming on the market. They're not really, a product for the masses yet because the price tag is quite substantial, but we do slowly but surely see them coming on the market.
That's great. And I'll just add that, at least in my opinion, at this point, right, technology can only go so far to replacing a human person in terms of a human connection. And that at this point, these systems are good for what I think Mathias has talked about, tasks and such. But when it comes to loneliness or social connection, I think that's a whole other level that is hard to outsource still to a robot at this time. So that's just my opinion. Certainly in 100 years or maybe even 50, things may be different. I think we're at the end of time, but I'll just acknowledge that Rita mentioned that we also need to acknowledge there's a difference between technology literacy versus social media literacy. Many young people can use their phones, but do not understand other types of technology. So thank you, Rita, for that point, that there are different kinds of literacy that we're thinking of. I think with that, we're at time, and we're so grateful to you for your time. We hope that you'll continue to stay in touch with us if we can be helpful, and we wish you well. Mathias, any final words?
No, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I hope you had a good had a good hour with us. Thank you.